From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Those killers has to be identified. They have to be brought to justice. And what we can do now is a request of the international partners to help us in identifying those killers, to be part of this international manhunt and investigation, because we need to identify those killers.
Haiti has declared a state of a siege after the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. Police have killed 4 suspects and arrested 2 as authorities probe who is behind the assassination. We get the latest, then go to Afghanistan.
If the Taliban come to Afghanistan by force, no one will accept them. People in all provinces are already standing up against the Taliban and taking up arms.
As the U.S. military says its withdrawal from Afghanistan is 90% complete, the Taliban escalates its offensive by seizing more districts. We'll speak to a longtime Afghan women's rights defender and an Afghan journalist in Kabul. Plus, we look at why the Palestinian Authority is cracking down on Palestinian demonstrators in the occupied West Bank. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Haiti's interim prime minister has declared a state of siege and imposed martial law following Wednesday morning's assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. The First Lady, Martine Moïse, was injured in the attack and airlifted to a Miami hospital where she's reportedly in critical but stable condition. Haitian police say they've arrested 2 suspected assassins and killed 4 others in a gunfight. Video from the scene shows the heavily armed attackers claimed to be from the U.S. DEA. That's the Drug Enforcement Administration. U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price dismissed those claims Wednesday and condemned the assassination of the Haitian president.
Those who seek to accomplish their political goals through violence and by subverting the rule of law will not succeed in thwarting the Haitian people and their desire for a brighter future. The U.S. twice supported coups that removed Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide from power, first in 1991, then again in 2004. It's unclear who's currently in charge of Haiti. Shortly before his assassination, President Moïse announced plans to install a new prime minister to replace interim premier Claude Joseph. 2 men are now claiming to be prime minister. After headlines, we'll have the latest on the unfolding crisis in Haiti. The World Health Organization says the global death toll from COVID-19 has topped 4 million, though the true figure is likely far higher. Indonesia recorded its highest ever one-day death toll Wednesday, with the Delta coronavirus variant fueling a surge in cases that's broken the healthcare system. Only about 5% of Indonesia's 270 million people are fully vaccinated. Japan's declared a COVID-19 state of emergency for Tokyo throughout the upcoming Summer Olympics. Officials had already banned foreign spectators at the Games and are discussing whether to abandon plans to allow domestic fans. In the United Kingdom, where just over half of all people are fully vaccinated, daily coronavirus cases have passed 30,000 for the first time since January. Prime Minister Boris Johnson still plans to lift most restrictions for England on July 19th. In the United States, coronavirus infections have increased by 35% over the last 2 weeks, according to a New York Times count. The Centers for Disease Control says the highly transmissible Delta coronavirus variant now represents over half of all new infections in the United States. At least 1 person was killed and several others injured Wednesday after Tropical Storm Elsa made landfall on Florida's northern Gulf Coast. Over the weekend, Elsa crashed through the Caribbean, killing at least 3 people and causing major damage to homes and other buildings.
California is bracing for dangerously high temperatures with a heat wave forecast to bring highs of 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the Central Valley and more than 120 degrees to some desert areas. This comes as new data show North America just experienced the hottest June ever recorded, with temperatures averaging more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. In Minnesota, Indigenous-led water protectors continue to take nonviolent direct action to stop construction of Enbridge's Line 3 tar sands pipeline. On Tuesday, activists locked themselves to drilling equipment and built blockades on access roads in a bid to stop Enbridge from drilling under the Willow River. Water protectors say construction crews appeared to puncture an aquifer, discharging drilling mud and chemicals into the river. This is Winona LaDuke, an Anishinaabe activist and executive director of Honor the Earth.
The rivers belong to the fish, they belong to the animals, and they belong to the people, and they don't belong to Enbridge. So be the people, protect the rivers.
If completed, Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline would account for carbon emissions equivalent to 50 new coal-fired power plants. U.S. troops and diplomatic workers in Iraq and Syria came under fire in at least 3 separate drone and rocket attacks over a 24-hour period. One attack targeted the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad's Green Zone. In a separate assault, rockets fired at an Iraqi air base in western Iraq left 2 U.S. troops injured Wednesday. They were the latest attacks on U.S. forces since late June, when President Biden ordered airstrikes in Syria and Iraq targeting an Iranian-backed militia. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights says Colombian authorities used excessive and disproportionate force to quell massive mobilizations against the right-wing government of Colombian President Iván Duque. Since the protests began, over 80 people have died, many at the hands of police and paramilitary forces. Commissioner Antonio Urrejola called on Colombia Wednesday to make structural changes to its militarized police force.
The Commission found that in repeated instances in different regions of the country that the state's response to protest was characterized as an excessive and disproportionate use of force. In many cases, the action included lethal force. The Inter-American Commission received serious complaints on the discriminate use of firearms against protesters and from people who aren't participating in the protests.
Back in the United States, the newly formed Atlanta Homeless Union has been protesting all week outside Atlanta City Hall. Earlier this week, police violently removed their encampment and arrested at least 6 people. The group of unhoused activists are demanding housing, health care, clean water, and a seat at the table in determining policies that impact their lives. In a statement, the group is calling on city officials to stop relying on Band-Aid solutions and to listen to those closest to the problem. Attorneys general from 36 states and Washington, D.C. have filed an antitrust lawsuit against Google, accusing the company of unlawfully stamping out its competition. The lawsuit says Google has paid off developers to keep them loyal to Google's platform and paid off other tech companies to prevent them from creating app stores that would compete with the dominant Google Play Store. Google collects a commission of up to 30% on app purchases. Former President Trump has sued the CEOs of Google, Facebook, and Twitter in a class-action lawsuit. Trump is seeking punitive damages for what he says is censorship and for platforms that have banned him to restore his accounts. In other Trump news, legal experts say more indictments against Trump Organization officials are likely after the Manhattan District Attorney last week criminally charged Chief Financial Officer Alan Weisselberg and the Trump Organization with charged him with criminal tax fraud, as well as charged the Trump Organization. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. court has suspended Rudy Giuliani's law license 2 weeks after a similar move in New York. The suspensions are related to Giuliani's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. In Surfside, Florida, search and rescue crews have given up hope of finding survivors in the rubble of the Champlain Tower South condominium 2 weeks after the oceanfront apartment building collapsed. This is Miami-Dade County Mayor Daniela Levine Cava.
At this point, we have truly exhausted every option available to us in the search and rescue mission. So today is about beginning the transition to recovery so that we can help to bring closure to the families who've been suffering and waiting for news.
Crews have found the remains of at least 54 people. 86 remain unaccounted for. On Wednesday, a grand jury agreed to investigate the building's collapse. In Minneapolis, Darnella Frazier, the teenager whose recording of George Floyd's murder was seen around the world, says her uncle was struck and killed by a police car during a car chase. Her uncle, 40-year-old Lanil Lamont Frazier, was not involved in the chase. Darnella Frazier said of the tragedy, quote, "Another black man lost his life in the hands of the police. Today has been a day full of heartbreak and sadness. The police made a bad decision by doing a high-speed chase on a residential road. That bad decision cost my uncle his life," she wrote. In New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo has declared a gun violence emergency. The state is allocating nearly $140 million to programs aimed at combating gun crimes, including increasing access to employment. The New York Times reports gun crime rose by as much as 75% in major New York cities since the start of the pandemic. The new measures will also open a path for civil lawsuits against gun manufacturers and distributors and stops people with warrants from purchasing firearms. And the United Kingdom's High Court has granted the Biden administration the right to appeal a lower court's ruling blocking the extradition of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to the United States. This comes as the Wall Street Journal reports U.S. officials have given assurances to the U.K. that Julian Assange would not be held in a supermax prison if extradited to the United States. On Wednesday, Assange's fiancée, Stella Maris, called on the Biden administration to end its pursuit of Julian Assange.
The lawyers of Julian were spied on. Their offices were broken into. Even our 6-month-old baby was targeted while he was in the embassy. And now the High Court has limited the grounds on which they are allowed to appeal. So the case is falling apart. If the Biden administration is serious about respecting the rule of law, the First Amendment, and of defending global press freedom, the only thing it can do is drop this case. This case is the most vicious attack on global press freedom in history.
Julian Assange faces up to 175 years in prison in the United States for violations of the Espionage Act related to the publication of classified documents exposing U.S. war crimes. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Nermeen Sheikh. We're both in New York. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, we're going to begin today in Haiti. The interim prime minister there has declared a state of siege and imposed martial law following the assassination of Haiti's president, Jovenel Moïse, who died in an armed attack on his home early Wednesday. The First Lady of Haiti, Martine Moïse, was injured in the attack and was airlifted to a Miami hospital. She's reportedly in stable but critical condition. Haitian authorities say police have killed 4 suspects and detained 2 others, but the individuals haven't been identified. Haiti's ambassador to the United States said the assassination was carried out by, quote, foreign mercenaries and professional killers. Video shot from outside the president's home shows the heavily armed attackers claimed to be from the USDEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. Listen carefully.
This is our operation. This is our operation, DEA. Operation DEA. Everybody go, continue, go. Everybody do not sit. This is a DEA operation. No.
This is a DEA operation. You hear them saying, the person speaking with an American accent, but this video hasn't been verified. On Wednesday, State Department spokesperson Ned Price was asked if the DEA was involved in the assassination.
can you speak to the DEA element of all of this? The ambassador also talked about this footage where they're identifying themselves as DEA agents, and he said that he doesn't believe in it. I mean, can you say that that's not the case, that you have an assessment that those are not DEA officials? Can you sort of, set the record straight on that?
Well, as you said, the Haitian ambassador himself has dismissed these allegations. These reports are absolutely false. The United States condemns this heinous act. These false reports are nothing more than that, just false reports.
It's unclear who's now in charge of Haiti. Under Haiti's constitution, the president of the Supreme Court would normally take power, but the judge recently died of COVID-19. Haiti's parliament was dissolved last year. Haiti now has two men claiming to be prime minister. Last week, President Moïse appointed Ariel Henry to become his 7th prime minister in 4 years, but Henry has not yet been sworn in. Meanwhile, Haiti's acting prime minister, Claude Joseph, has assumed power following Moïse's assassination. On Wednesday, Joseph addressed the nation.
The first elements of information we have at our disposal make us understand it happens to be a group of English and Spanish-speaking persons. They were carrying huge caliber weapons and killed the president. As the incumbent chief of government, I gathered this morning a special Supreme Council of the National Police. In strict accordance with Article 149 of the Constitution, I just presided an extraordinary council of ministers where we decided to declare a state of siege on the whole territory.
Haiti was already facing a political, security, and economic crisis prior to the assassination of the president. Earlier this year, opponents of Moïse accused him of orchestrating a coup to stay in power beyond February 7th, when his term officially ended. We go now to Guerline Joseph, co-founder and executive director of Haitian Bridge Alliance that works with Haitian immigrants in the United States. As all of this unfolds, Guerline, if you can give your assessment of what took place. I mean, you've got this video with an American voice saying this is the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. This hasn't been verified. Apparently, people were speaking in Spanish, of course, not the language of Haiti. How is it that even this group of people could get to the president's house without the acquiescence of the police or the military, which would suggest a kind of coup going on? What do you understand at this point as you talk to people around Haiti?
Good morning, Amy, and thank you for having me. As all of these are developing on the ground in Haiti, actually, after we received the call yesterday morning in the middle of the night at 2:45, my first question was, what happened? Where are the guards? Where are the extreme security that the head of state is supposed to be having? As we heard from the video, allegedly, we do not know exactly who those people are. I understand that people on the ground are still looking into those allegations, so we are hoping to get a light on those. But what I can tell you is that today, as of yesterday, Haiti is in mourning. Whether you are, for the Jovenel government or against, his ideologies, today the people are in mourning. Today the people are in fear. Today the streets of Haiti are empty because people are trying to make sense of what just happened.
And Guerline, could you talk about the significance of the assailants allegedly claiming to be from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration of the U.S.? To your knowledge, has the DEA operated in Haiti in the past? And if so, would the invoking the DEA overcome, as you said, the extreme security that the president's residence has?
Well, I am not a person who deals with those specific issues. Our main issue is dealing with immigration and what's happening on the ground when it affects people that are being forced to leave the country. So as those investigations continues, I do hope that we get clarifications of what's happening, and whomever are involved in this extremely, extremely disturbing and inhuman act in the country of Haiti will be brought to justice.
Gurleen, could you talk a little bit? Of course, we reported earlier, and there have been widespread reports of this, of the political violence and security situation in Haiti prior to this assassination. The government accused of using gangs to crush the opposition, many hundreds who've been detained, arrested, or killed in the last several years. And you deal, of course, with migrants coming to the U.S. What do you know of that situation, and how many people who come to the U.S. Are fleeing that violence?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so as you just mentioned, what we are witnessing is a result of a long and bloody acts that's been happening. As a matter of fact, last week alone, we have an estimated 15 young men and women who were massacred, including journalists, including a young woman who was leading, the fight on behalf of the Haitian community on the ground. We are seeing that the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse as part of a long strike of bloody massacres on the people on the ground, and now to the highest level of office in Haiti. So we have to understand that this didn't just happen, yesterday in the middle of the night. This has been a product of both internal violence and external violence that have been plunging Haiti into the darkness. What I said is into a new abyss where we are seeing right now. We do not know what the next move will be, but please understand that this is part of a long history of bloody murders that have been happening in the country. And now we are at a level where Haiti is in mourning. Haiti is in pain. Our soul, our hearts are crying for justice. Our hearts are crying for peace. Our hearts are crying for protection, because we do understand, as we serve migrants in the United States, they do not want to leave home. But what do people have to do when home is in the mouth of a shark? As we look at what's happening in the country, we are also seeing, the effect of that in migration, forced displacement. And the majority of the people leaving their home countries are because of abuse, because of political unrest, because of the type of issues we are seeing in Haiti right now. So our heart goes to Jovenel Moïse's family. The First Lady, Martine, we are praying for her recovery, but we are also praying for those who have lost their lives without cause for the past week, the past year, the past month, as you have mentioned before.
And before we end, Gurleen, you live here in the United States. You are a part of what, as many call, Haiti's 10th department, Haitians who live in the United States. When we spoke to you last, then President Moïse, who's now been assassinated, was supposed to leave office. The Biden administration has supported Moïse, and even this week there was a deportation flight to Haiti, and you deal with immigrants all the time. Can you talk about what you're calling on the Biden administration to do in this time of this unprecedented assassination?
Absolutely. Again, as you mentioned, as of February 7th, depends on which way you interpret the Constitution. President Jovenel was supposed to leave from the opposition understanding and how they interpret the Constitution. And at the same time, the government of President Jovenel Moïse, the way they interpret the Constitution, said that they were supposed to stay until 2022. But what we are asking President Biden to do is, one, to quickly release the Federal Register notice so that Haitians who are currently in the United States are able to apply for TPS, that we have fought so long to be able to win that battle for over 150,000 Haitians who are already in the United States as of May 21st, 2021. And at the same time, we are asking for protection for asylum seekers who have been at the U.S.-Mexico border for between a year to 5 years, who have been waiting for a chance to apply for asylum. And we are asking President Biden to immediately rescind Title 42, which has been used as a vehicle not only to destroy lives, but create that pipeline for expulsion and deportation to Haiti. And Amy, as you just mentioned, the eve of this assassination, there were a deportation to Haiti. So it is absolutely unbelievable for us to see, as we just received TPS on the ground, of the insecurity that's on the ground at the same time for the United States to be deporting people to Haiti. So we are asking for a complete halt for all deportations to Haiti. We are asking for the release of all the Haitian asylum seekers who are currently caged in immigration prisons in the United States. We are asking the President Biden and his administration to provide protection, security for those asylum seekers and immigrants who have come to our shores, asking for protection as we see what's happening on the ground today.
Yerline Joseph, we want to thank you for being with us, co-founder, executive director of Haitian Bridge Alliance. Coming up, as the U.S. military says its withdrawal from Afghanistan is 90% complete, the Taliban escalates its offensive by seizing more districts. We'll speak to a longtime Afghan women's rights defender and an Afghan journalist in Kabul. Stay with us. A Rose Among the Ruins by the Afghan Music Project. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. As we turn to Afghanistan, on Wednesday, Taliban fighters attacked the capital of the Afghan province of Badghis as part of an escalating Taliban offensive in northern and northwest Afghanistan. The Taliban now controls roughly a third of all 421 districts and district centers in Afghanistan. The Taliban offensive comes as the U.S. and NATO forces are withdrawing from the country after nearly 20 years of fighting. U.S. Central Command estimates the U.S. withdrawal is 90% complete. Last week, the U.S. military left Bagram Airfield, a key center of command in America's longest war. An Afghan official said U.S. forces did not coordinate the departure with local authorities, resulting in a period of looting at the airbase before Afghan forces took over control. As the U.S. winds down its withdrawal from Afghanistan, at least 650 troops are expected to remain to secure the U.S. embassy in Kabul. In addition, the New York Times has reported the U.S. will maintain a, quote, shadowy combination of clandestine special operations forces, Pentagon contractors, and covert intelligence operatives. President Biden is scheduled to speak about Afghanistan today. Meanwhile, representatives of the Taliban and the Afghan government met in Iran today for high-level peace talks. In a joint statement, the two sides said, quote, war is not the solution to the Afghanistan problem. We're joined now by two guests. Seema Samar is with us, a longtime Afghan women and human rights defender, served as Minister of Women's Affairs of Afghanistan from 2001 to 2003. In 2012, she was awarded the Right Livelihood Award support over advocacy for women's rights. She's joining us from Houston, Texas. And joining us from Afghanistan is Ali Latifi, freelance journalist based in Kabul. His recent piece for Al Jazeera headlined, "Afghans say recent Taliban advances force them to take up arms." Let's begin in Kabul with Ali. Can you describe what you are seeing on the ground? According to Al Jazeera, what, 30% of the country now under Taliban control? Do you find that you can actually verify this?
It's hard to verify these statistics because, for one thing, a lot of these districts are often trading hands. You know, they go back and forth. And this is something that's been going on for years. You know, the difference is that in the past, this kind of cat and mouse game took weeks or months, sometimes even years. Now it's in a matter of days where, you know, you'll get a report that this district fell to the Taliban, and then 2, 3, 4 days later, they say that it was regained by the government. In the last week, I've been to 2 different, well, including Kabul, 3 different provinces of the country. You know, I've met with people who are part of these local uprising forces, which is what I wrote about for the Al Jazeera story. I met with security forces. I met with officials, including provincial governors. And they're really putting a lot of weight behind these uprising movements, saying that they are supportive of actual people trying to defend their own areas, of taking guns that were all either already in their homes, left over from the civil war or the Taliban time when they were hiding these guns, or even the current last 20 years when disarmament kind of went awry, was never really successful, or in some cases are handing out new guns to them. Because the idea is that they want to show the Taliban that the people are A, against them, B, supporting the national security forces, and that C, they are willing to fight against them, against the Taliban. So it's really a big gamble at this moment.
Ali, can you explain why you're concerned about this, the fact that former mujahideen, as well as many other volunteers, are taking up arms? What you wrote about, what do you fear might happen?
It's not necessarily my fear. It's a fear that's permeating. Look, there are plenty of people that absolutely 100% support these uprisings because they think it's localizing security, it's bringing power back to the people. But then there are some people who fear that, you know, if you're handing out all of these guns, A, can you get them back when you've supposedly won the war, or, you know, reached your goal of somehow getting rid of the Taliban? And B, can you make sure that these people will not turn their guns against the people of these areas? Because in some areas that we went, you know, the people that were part of these uprisings, they may have been from the same province or the same region, but they weren't necessarily from the same exact district or the same exact area as where they were fighting in. So there are questions, will this lead to tensions? And could we end up in a situation like 1992 where, you know, all of these armed movements essentially turned their guns against each other, and there were rockets raining down on Kabul? The entire city was divided along ethnic lines and lines according to their allegiance to different armed groups, and, you know, the city was ghettoized, and there was all kinds of in a way lawlessness, you know, at that time, which is what eventually led to the Taliban coming to power. So that's really the fear that people have, is can you control this when you need to?
And Dr. Seema Samad, you were the Minister for Women's Affairs from 2001 to 2003, that is following the installation of the government after the U.S. Invasion. Could you talk about your concerns regarding the Taliban? The Taliban, as we've discussed, reportedly in charge of a third of districts across Afghanistan, and also the broader effects of the withdrawal of U.S. and foreign troops from the country.
Good morning to you, and good morning to your listener. I think let me correct I was Minister of Women's Affairs only for 6 months, but then I was, for a long time, I was the chairperson of Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, which was also one of the institution, I would say that one of the success stories of the country, which done the promotion and protection of human rights and continue to do the same work. I think, as my colleague said, the 30% of the country or district is under control of the Taliban, but the people are not supportive of their presence. It used to be exchange of districts between the two warring factions, but this time they are more rapid. It is concern because we don't know what will happen, but the concern of the people, more people are displaced, and it's a lot of violence which push the people out of their homes, and the country is already, the people are already poor, and the economy is not in a very good shape. So it is a concern of more displacement, more poverty, more tension. And on the issue of people uprising and protection or supporting or standing against Taliban, the problem is that it requires a proper management, as the previous speaker already said. If it's not managed properly, the people of Afghanistan doesn't have a good experience with that kind of uprising. And I hope it will not create any ethnic and political tension between the people who are against Taliban. But I think the issue is that clearly it was not really, the withdrawal was not in the right time. At least it should have done after a ceasefire between the different political parties or the different groups, warring faction in the country. So that has not happened, unfortunately. And I think the other issue is that, of course, Afghanistan should not be abandoned, because we had the experience before, which was end up with the serious attack on the U.S. soil. And if that has happened, then it will be another disaster, not only for the Afghans, but for everybody around the world.
Dr. Seema Samar, I wanted to get your response to the Taliban spokesperson, Suhail Shaheen, talking about the Taliban's position on women's rights on CNN just a few weeks ago.
We are not against the basic rights of women, that is education and their work. Only because we are an Islamic society, they have to observe the Islamic hijab. Even now, if you see, go to the Kabul city, the women are observing hijab voluntarily by themselves, because they are this different culture, Afghan culture and Islamic culture.
He was speaking on Fareed Zakaria's GPS on CNN. Dr. Seema Samar, can you respond to what he has said? And also talk about the talks that are going on right now in Iran between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And previously it was in Doha, but that wasn't including the Afghan government. And where women stand in all of this?
Well, I think on the stand of the Taliban spokesperson that they respect the basic human rights. Why not all of the human rights, not only education and their work? And as he said, that the Afghan women already respecting hijab, then what is their problem, actually? And it's the same thing that they said when they were in power in Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. I think they have to show in action, because the areas which is under control of Taliban, they have not shown this, the changes that they claim that they have been changed and they are respecting the women's rights. Unfortunately, women are beaten up and simple issues, violating their basic human rights. That is one issue. The second point, the second question that you asked, I think that in the Tehran talks, you see that there is no woman at all. And in Doha, we are not satisfied with having 4 women in the peace talks among the 42 or men. But they choose the 42, the number, because it was 42 years of war, but now it's 43 years of war. And it's going to be 44, unfortunately. I personally believe that there's no harm if they really sit and talk. But it should be inclusive. It should be coordinated. Everybody should not, I mean, somebody is sitting in Moscow, somebody is sitting in Doha, somebody is sitting in another part of the world, in China or in Iran. But it should be coordinated, and it should be a way to get out of this problem. And Afghan people should realize that they are responsible for their country, and they should come to an idea and a plan that to end the war in the country. It's very violent, and people keep losing life every day.
And what do Afghan women need most right now, Seema?
Well, I think they need recognition. They have to be recognized, first of all, and then they have to be included in the process. And then with inclusion, and of course, they should be supported, not giving their name in some position, but they will not get financial and political support. So that is really important, that our existence should be recognized in the country as a half of the population, and we should be included in all the policy, all the issues and relation of the country and the people and the social and the cultural and the peace process and the peace building and implementation of peace agreement in case we reach to a peace agreement.
Ali Latifi, people have pointed out that the war in Afghanistan has been, that there have been foreign countries involved in addition to the U.S. The U.S. was not the only one. Could you speak specifically about the involvement of Pakistan and its continuing alleged support for the Taliban? The Prime Minister Imran Khan giving an interview to the New York Times recently saying that whatever leverage his government had with the Taliban has vanished once the U.S. announced its withdrawal, because the Taliban took that withdrawal as a sign of its victory.
Well, I think just the fact that Imran Khan admits to the New York Times that his government had even 1% of leverage with the Taliban should say a lot. The fact that, and it's not just Pakistan, this is why it's ironic that the talks are happening in Tehran as well, is that we've gotten clear proof on the ground that Pakistan and Iran are very heavily involved with the Taliban, are aiding them, are abetting them, are supplying them, are providing them safe haven. There's literal on the ground evidence. When you talk to police in different provinces, they will say that we found weapons and ammunition that was very clearly coming from Pakistan or from Iran. People will talk about the presence of Iranian and Pakistani fighters on the ground. I talked to an MP from the western province of Farah about a few months ago, and he was saying that when he was in charge of security in the south and the west, when he was working in security in the south and the west, he saw Irani fighters standing aside the Taliban. And people will say the same thing about Pakistanis. And then there's clear evidence. For instance, when Mullah Mansour, the second leader of the Taliban, was still alive, there was footage of him going through the Karachi airport to go to Iran, and I believe also the Emirates. There were pictures of different Pakistani leaders living in the areas around the Durand Line. The fact that Osama bin Laden, if the whole point of this war was about Al-Qaeda and 9/11 and bin Laden, he was found in Abbottabad. The statement that the media always uses is that he was found near the Pakistani equivalent of West Point, and yet there is no real pressure ever being put on Pakistan, right? If Imran Khan says, I have very little or no leverage against the Taliban, the question then comes, why isn't Washington and Berlin and London and Paris and all these other places asking him, well, when did you have leverage over the Taliban? Why did you have leverage over the Taliban? And why have you not been doing anything to exercise that leverage in a positive way? And this is something that, upsets everyone in Afghanistan, because, as I said, there's documented proof, both on the ground here and just things like pictures and footage that show that, you know, Pakistan has a very active role, and Iran, in supporting the Taliban, and yet there's no real ever pressure, physical, real pressure being put on Pakistan because of it.
And Ali Latifi, today President Biden will be addressing the issue of Afghanistan. It's been almost 20 years, the United States' longest war. Talk about the results of the U.S. invasion and occupation on Afghanistan.
I was just reading today, there was a headline that the U.S. is considering giving visas and support to Afghan women and rights activists and journalists who may feel in danger after the U.S. withdrawal. And I think just that headline enough says, you know, if in 2001, George Bush's entire justification, and, you know, he paraded Laura Bush around as well, and, you know, Hillary Clinton, when she became Secretary of State, you know, went on these speaking tours and came on these missions and kept talking about things like human rights and women's rights and so on and so forth. And yet, literally in 2021, 2 months before their withdrawal, we have a headline saying they may have to evacuate, you know, thousands of women and rights workers 20 years after their invasion of the country, allegedly, you know, to support women, to reestablish human rights, to reestablish democracy. I think that in itself says everything.
Well, we want to thank you both for joining us. Ali Latifi, freelance reporter based in Kabul, will link to your Al Jazeera piece headlined, "Afghans say recent Taliban advances forced them to take up arms." And we want to thank Dr. Seema Samar, Afghan woman and human rights defender. As we turn now to why the Palestinian Authority is cracking down on Palestinian demonstrators in the occupied West Bank, we'll go to Ramallah. Stay with us. Stories by Karim Badili featuring Latria Gibran. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We turn now to the occupied West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority is facing intense criticism for violently cracking down on Palestinian protesters in recent weeks, following the death of the human rights activist Nizar Banat in Palestinian Authority custody. Banat was a vocal critic of the PA. He was arrested June 24th by PA forces who broke into a relative's house where he was staying in the town of Jura. Relatives who witnessed the attack say Banat was beaten before his arrest. Hours after his detention, he was declared dead. This is Nizar Banat's wife, Jahan Banat, and relative Hussein Banat.
2 months ago, there was a shooting towards us from unknown people. They wanted to kill Nizar because they targeted our bedroom. For 2 months, he has been away from home. We didn't see him. We heard at 3 a.m. that he was arrested. They took all his belongings and laptop. 2 hours later, he was announced dead.
We were at home at 3:30 a.m. Suddenly we heard noise of breakthrough. They broke the windows and opened the door of the room where we were sleeping, and they were from the preventative forces. When they broke in, we were sleeping, and Nizar too. We woke up while they were beating Nizar with their metal sticks on his head.
Nizar Banat had run on behalf of an opposition party in the parliamentary elections that President Mahmoud Abbas would eventually call off. On Saturday, hundreds of Palestinians protested in Ramallah, calling for Abbas to step down. This comes as the Israeli newspaper Ynet reported last week the Palestinian Authority is attempting to buy tear gas canisters, stun grenades, and other non-lethal munitions from Israel. For more, we go to Ramallah, where we're joined by Mariam Barghouti, Palestinian writer. Her recent op-ed in the Washington Post is headlined, "Who is the Palestinian Authority protecting? Not us." Okay, why don't you lay out who is the Palestinian Authority and who are they protecting, Mariam?
Hi, thank you for having me, Amy. The Palestinian Authority is a regime that was created through the 1994 Oslo Accords, and it was meant to serve as an interim government for civil administration of Palestinian affairs. The Palestinian Authority now is acting like a police state without the state. And what is happening is a complete assault on Palestinian rights, on Palestinian lives, on Palestinian voices. And the only thing that is being protected are the security forces, the regime complex.
Mariam, you write in your piece that, quote, the horrors like those of Israeli crimes are too ubiquitous to describe. The only consistency is that the violence in all of its forms and different uniforms sustains Israeli colonialism. Could you explain why you think that's the case? And also respond to the argument by the Palestinian Authority that their fear is centered around Hamas.
Right. So the Palestinian Authority has often collaborated with Israel at the expense of Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority has adhered to the agreement of security coordination with Israel based on the Oslo Accords. And it was a one-way street where Palestinians are being handed over to Israel for vocalizing their complete refusal of anything that means colonialism, of anything that means ethnic cleansing. And the Palestinian Authority did this for Israel. The Palestinian Authority put sanctions on Gaza when Gaza was being brutally attacked by Israel, when it was being starved by Israel, when its electricity was being also cut by Israel. They colluded with Israeli colonialism against Palestinians in Gaza. When we hear the Palestinian Authority say, fears like it's Hamas, it reminds me a lot of the same narrative that Israeli officials say. Well, Hamas, Palestinians are resisting, but no, it's Hamas. And it's this attempt to criminalize us. Nizar Banat wasn't Hamas. I'm not Hamas. We're Palestinians who want to be Palestinian, who want to say Palestinian from the river to the sea. And the Palestinian Authority allowed Israel to confine us to the West Bank and Gaza. It has even negated the right of return for refugees. It has ignored Palestinians with Israeli citizenship in terms of representation and demands.
Mariam, could you explain who funds the Palestinian Authority and what you think needs to happen?
Well, the Palestinian Authority is funded from different actors and parties, namely international states within the EU, the US, and other actors as well. So we shouldn't just confine to who is funding. The bigger focus is what is being funded. Most of the funding is coming under the emblem of capacity building of Palestinians, but it's really going to the security forces. This is where the money is being flooded. Every year, I just see newer police cars instead of more schools, and that's because this is what Israel also wants. It wants us to turn into watchdogs so it can become a cheaper occupation and a cheaper colonialism on that front. The PA is not just being funded in material value. It is being supported by tolerating the repression. We have been speaking about this for over a decade. Over a decade, Palestinians were getting beaten in the streets. Every time this happens, a little media attention comes at this, but the support and the tolerance of it continues. And now we're being politically assassinated.
Can you talk, Mariam Barghouti, about just who Nizar Banat was, how he died, and why this is so significant when talking about the role of the Palestinian Authority?
Nizar Banat was a very vocal critic of corruption, namely the Palestinian Authority. He was attacked in Hebron by security forces, taken under the pretext of being arrested, but he was beaten so brutally that the images of his corpse were covered in purple and blue. I personally couldn't even look at the images, so I can't even imagine his family and close friends. He was a Palestinian that said something about an authority that is pretending to represent us, but is actually forcing us into our homes, into whispers, into fear of wanting to live in dignity, of wanting to live justly, of wanting to live as Palestinians. Nizar was also a father. Nizar was also a husband. He wasn't just the critic of the Palestinian Authority. He wasn't just a Palestinian that refused Israeli colonialism. In the end, he was also a person just like all of us, where we're learning all of these different dynamics because our lives are on the line. We can't afford to not know.
And Mariam, could you say, at the moment, of course, this repression is taking place in the midst of the pandemic. Could you explain what the situation is in terms of vaccination and how the Palestinian Authority has been dealing with the pandemic?
The Palestinian Authority initially began their response to the pandemic well, according to polling and surveying well. And then it slowly started showing how the state of emergency was also being used to enforce new legislations, new laws that repress Palestinians, and continued to solidify the grasp that they have on our right to express, on our right to change. And what is happening right now, not just in vaccinations, where the Palestinian Authority and Israel had an agreement to exchange Pfizer vaccines, but it turned out that the ones that Israel was going to give were actually about to expire soon. Beyond that recklessness and beyond that sinister move by Israel, the pandemic is being also used to enforce new laws to repress Palestinians within a legal framework. And it is very dangerous because if they won't politically assassinate us, they will shove us in jails, just like Israel does with its military detention.
Mariam, we just have less than a minute, but I wanted to ask you both about the new government and the continued now bombing of the Gaza Strip on Saturday and what Israel's military called retaliation for incendiary balloons launched from the besieged Palestinian territory, latest violation of the tenuous ceasefire on May 21st. Your final comments?
No new government in Israel is going to bring change. What's going to bring change is ending the ethnic cleansing and calling out apartheid and persecution for what it is. This new government is doing the same thing that the old government did. Just because the uniform changes, just because the ways change, doesn't mean it isn't what it is, which is ethnic cleansing.
We want to thank you so much for being with us, Mariam, again. Mariam Barghouti, Palestinian writer and researcher based in Ramallah. We'll link to her piece in the Washington Post headlined, "Who is the Palestinian Authority Protecting? Not Us." And that does it for our show. Today, a fond farewell to Democracy Now! Senior producer Carla Wills. Carla, your brilliance, your humor, your compassion, and your passion for social justice reporting certainly helped to make Democracy Now! What it is today. It is never goodbye. Just thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Well, Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Messiah Rhodes, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Terracena, Tammy Warrenoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alkoff, Marie Astudio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Massoud, and Adriana Contreras. Our general manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Miriam Barnard, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grand, Dennis Moynihan. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.